lovely to be here. So I'm going to ask the question, is transformational integrity possible? I think so. And that really comes from my experience working in the aid sector over the last few years, where I've been able to work with communities to transform services and infrastructure to ensure that they're getting vital, what we would consider vital public services. So if you look at the pictures on the screen, so if you start on the right-hand side, the first picture is of a boy in Isfana in Kyrgyzstan. I think we've got someone from Kyrgyzstan here today. Who, after many years of corruption in the supply chain, we were able to work with the community, the government, and the local contractor to ensure that clean drinking water was provided to the local community. And what we did really is have a methodology that worked to give access to information, engage the different stakeholders, and then ultimately test whether the services were being delivered effectively. So you can see the middle pictures are community members collecting data, putting it into a mobile app so they could feed that back to the government many miles away. And then the final two pictures are water pipes in DRC, so in Congo. We were able to ensure again that water pipes were delivered after many years of fighting by the local community with the contractor to ensure that 50,000 people were able to have clean drinking waters in their homes. And the final picture is in Kenya, where communities were able to lobby with their local government to get a primary school put into the community. And then they went further and asked for a teacher to be provided. So you can see the happy children learning English there. So the question, I think, is if transformational integrity is possible in the aid sector at the local level, is it possible in the organic cotton sector? And that's what I want to explore with you a little bit this afternoon. So I guess what I'm going to do is actually start with the opposite. What happened? And I want to make this session really interactive, so I'm going to ask you to shout things out. What happens if you hear that a spinner is mixing organic with conventional or with GMO cotton? What would you do? So I appreciate we've got lots of different people in the audience from different areas in the supply network. What would you actually do? Shout out some answers. Get angry. Yep, good. Investigate, very good. Disqualify it, so maybe you go to a different spinner. Accept it? Yeah, accept conventional cotton instead of organic? Talk to them. Oh, very good, very enlightened.
But it all depends who am I.
Okay.
If I'm an enforcement agency, I will behave differently. If I'm a consumer, I will behave differently.
Absolutely, yeah. So it depends who you are. So great answers. I think there's a plethora of options. Some of these have been thrown out. You could actually ignore it. You could pretend it wasn't there and just carry on doing business. You could go for some compliance and investigate what's really happening. You can test, you can report them to the authorities, or you could go elsewhere. There are lots of options when we're faced with corruption. So moving on from that, though, what happens if you hear that it wasn't actually corruption, but it was an accident? So you've got a conventional cotton field next to an organic cotton field. The wind was blowing one day, and it blew seeds across from the conventional cotton to the organic cotton, which means that now your organic cotton is contaminated. What do you do in that scenario? Any ideas? Label it as conventional. Change CB. I didn't. Sue Monsanto. Okay. Any other ideas? I mean, that's great. I think you could do the same, couldn't you? You could ignore it. You could go through compliance activities, so you could put a wider gap between you and your neighbor's field. You could do some more testing. You could go elsewhere. There's lots of options. So we've had the first case where actually it was hearsay. There wasn't really corruption there. When we dug into it a little bit more detail, we found it was an accident. Then the final case is, what happens if it actually is corruption? That the seed provider is actually mixing seed. So it's mixing organic with conventional. And the reason that they're doing that is because the price they're getting for their seeds is not high enough. And so they're trying to cut corners. What do you do in that case? This is real corruption. Report them. Very good. Stop buying seed from them. Sue them. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we have lots of options, don't we? But I think what I wanted to sort of demonstrate through the story is that actually, on first glance, we thought it was corruption. It turned out to be hearsay. Then it was an accident. Then we really found corruption. So what I'm trying to show really is that it's complex. We have to really get to the root cause of the problem. And there are lots of options of how we can deal with it and try and build integrity within the supply networks. But the question is, what happens if we get it wrong? You know, if we've switched farmers or spinners, they could lose their livelihoods. And perhaps they weren't even involved with corrupt practices. If the press get hold of it, potentially you could have massive scandals across your supply network for your brand. Generally, I think a lot of people talked about kind of compliance or investigating. You have increased compliance costs. And if it's not really corruption, or you're not focusing your efforts in the right area, then actually you invest a lot of money and it doesn't solve the root of the problem. So ultimately, what we want to do is get to the root of the issue and deal with the complexities of it. So what I was trying to demonstrate is that there is complex supply networks. There are many stakeholders involved. We need to not just take things on face value, but really dig into what is actually happening to work out how we can deal with it the most effectively. Now, I want to bring in a little bit of theory here. The Cressy fraud triangle it kind of looks at, from a theoretical point of view, why do people commit fraud? And really, Cressy says that if you have the kind of intersection of rationalization, opportunity, and pressure, then you're very likely to engage in corrupt practices or in fraud. What does that mean in practice? It means that perhaps if you're a seed provider and you're trying to get your kids in school and you don't have enough money, that you might feel the pressure of that, understand that no one's coming to test your seed, and therefore you have opportunity that you can rationalize the situation. And you can say, well, actually, maybe if I mix the seeds, nobody will know. No one is testing, it's okay. So hopefully, and I know I'm talking to the converted, we know it's a complex situation. There are lots of stakeholders involved. So the second question becomes then, can integrity help? Now, I would say that integrity really is, well, it's the alignment of accountability, competence, ethics with corruption control or without corruption. But ultimately, what we're trying to do is increase trust and trustworthiness between stakeholders, get the dialogue going so that you can deal with corruption, but actually build integrity within your supply networks. So what does that mean in practice? So I've put up some definitions there. Accountability is the ability to check that we're doing what we say we're doing. Competence is doing it well. Ethics is doing it with public purpose. And corruption or corruption control is doing it without corruption, ultimately. So compliance is a vital component when looking to build integrity. So I know Peter's going to come on and talk a little bit more about the ways that we can build integrity within the sector and what's being done really well. But I want to sort of end, I guess, really with some real practical ways of how we can build integrity. And what I've done is I've pulled it out, and I know this is a busy slide, but pulled it out in terms of accountability, competence, ethics, and corruption control. And I'll give you a chance to read it, but ultimately what we can do is we can improve the transparency and visibility across our supply networks. We can provide training for farmers, spinners, ginners on appropriate processes, controls, and culture for organic cotton. We can adjust some of the price differentials to provide better incentives for people to deliver organic cotton. And we can continue to focus on and improve our compliance processes. So I'm finishing up there, but ultimately what I wanted you to kind of think about is that when you come across corruption is not to panic, not to ignore it, but to identify it, reflect, investigate to get the data, and then respond. And collaborate within the sector to build integrity. Thank you.
I really agree with everything Joy said. So a lot of what I've got to say is try and reinforce her messages and to maybe give a bit more colour and background to what she had to say from an organic perspective, and particularly from an organic farmer's perspective. I actually grow seed crops on our farm in Norfolk. We grow wheat and barley and peas and beans, all for organic seed. So my reaction when she said, what would you do if you found fraud, is sue them straight away. They're interfering with my market. And the market's important. Joy used a word I can strongly endorse, which was trust. We're looking for integrity to build trust, and we do have trust in the market, I think. It's fair to say Textile Exchange have seen a huge growth in the global market. We've seen a big growth by British standards in the UK market, which is certainly not an easy one. The latest figures were 16% increase, much bigger growth internationally. An interesting insight from consumers in the UK was that a big increase, 42%, was in personal care products like tampons, sanitary towels and cotton wool buds. And the UK company in that market, which saw big growth, said it was because consumers are getting more and more concerned about the implications of cotton grown with pesticides being in or close to their bodies. And I want to come back to that. But it seemed to me to demonstrate that we start from a position of considerable trust from consumers and manufacturers. Joy gave us a really interesting example of where you jump to one conclusion and then actually one investigation comes to another. We had this with oats, a cereal crop in the UK, which was found to be organic oats, quite heavily contaminated with Roundup and with a growth regulator. And the manufacturers selling cereals with oats in, when this was discovered, immediately thought the farmers were to blame. And as a farmer, I resented that, I have to admit. Then I'm afraid in what has become rather a typical British reaction to things, they decided it wasn't the British farmers, but it was farmers in some other country, and it was imported oats that were to blame. It has uncomfortable parallels with recent debates in the UK. But that wasn't true either. And in fact, what turned out, after quite a long investigation, quite a lot of hassle, and some conflicts in different bits of the organic supply chain, that it was the processing. Oats were being processed in the UK in 2 or 3 factories, one of which processed organic and non-organic oats, and oats are processed wet and quite hot, and there was a huge build-up in pesticides. So, investigate, look into it, find what the true reasons are, as Joy said. Absolutely right. And the integrity is absolutely vital to the trust in the organic supply chain. I would say, I'd add to what Joy said, and we've had this discussion about organic food a lot. First of all, we guarantee a process, but not an outcome. There's an argument going on in the EU at the moment, those of you in European countries will know, as to whether we should test organic integrity by testing for pesticides. And those of us that oppose that, as IFOAM do, say, why should we test for something which is caused by somebody else and then we take the hit? And I'm going to come back to just how serious a threat that is in a moment. I think the other key thing I've learned in 15 years at the Soil Association is that we need to be open. If we're not doing things that people expect of us or doing things that people don't expect, say so. We've had journalists ring up in huge excitement saying, we understand you do use pesticides. We've just been done. We say, look at the website. There's a list of all the pesticides the European Union organic regulation allows. It's been there for 10 years. no story, no excitement, no interest. Openness and it leads to trustworthiness, even if you're open about things which you will feel people think, oh, they wouldn't do that. Better to be open, always. And people, in my experience, are much more rational and reasonable about this outside the organic movement than those of us in it. So people outside say, of course we understand you have to do this, and of course we know the world works like that, when the organic people inside say, oh God, we can't admit to that. So, openness, people will understand that. And be clear that we have a lot to be proud of, as we talked about in one of the session I was in before lunch, that organic is a gold standard. We really do well for the farm and with GOTS and the organic cotton supply chain and with fair trade. And we heard in our session before lunch, most fair trade is organic. Now I want to talk a bit about why people trust us and why they should trust us and remind ourselves about what we deliver. We produced a report in the Soil Association a little while ago about feeding the world, how organic farming helps feed the world. And you know the figures about appalling world hunger, chronic hunger, 1 in 8 people. 98% of the hungry live in developing countries. It's a shameful number in developed countries like the US and the UK, but still it's mainly a developing country problem. And that's where 99% of the cotton fibre comes from. And talking to businesses, I've heard played back to me this argument that if businesses in textile industry as a whole want to do one thing that would really change the lives of the huge numbers of the poorest people on the planet, moving to organic cotton is it. We have an incredible story to tell there, and we should tell it. And in our report we did, we had some great pictures of food crops and other crops being grown alongside cotton. This is in India, and I'm using this guy from India's sunflower as the theme of my talk. It's true in China. There's a child with pictures of all the food grown with cotton by this farmer in China. It's true in Africa, and it's true even in Texas, in the Great Plains, where Larea farms and where you've had the problem of GM contamination, I was hearing about, of Roundup spray being sprayed and finding some of Larea's seeds were actually GM, not organic. And I want to say a word or two about that because it's one of the real integrity issues that people worry about. Now, where is Larea? Is she here somewhere? Oh, right. I'm going to be rude about her behind her back. You'll have to pass this on. Because, of course, the best answer to the problem is to move to a country like Turkey. Now, whether all the cotton growers in Texas will do that or not, I rather doubt. But Turkey is a popular position to grow cotton because it's banned GM seed. And actually, that's not as far-fetched as it may seem. Because if you look at parallels with GM contamination of organic food, there are a number of lessons we can learn. Denmark discovered about 10 years ago, I think it was, quite high levels of GM in imported, what was meant to be organic soya, going into animal feed for organic animals in Denmark. But through a really rigorous system of controls and checking and testing, they more or less, as I understand it, solved the problem. And we copied that in the UK and did the same and did risk-based testing at really sensitive points. And in fact, most of the scandals of GM contamination in the food industry generally, not just organic but generally, have come from two sources. They've come from contaminated seed, so Larea's problem wasn't unique. There's been the destruction of a whole long-grain rice crop in America. They discovered GM wheat being grown in America, although it's never been cleared for cultivation at all, and there are other examples. And the other big area of problems is in the supply chain. So although normally we think about pollution, of things blowing across and things like that, actually most of the problems come from human cock-ups and human error. muddle in the supply chain. Farmers have been given seeds which are not even cleared for planting, even as GM, and things like that. And there is a role for testing, but really identifying where the key risks are and asking people to test there, I would say. I think another lesson from the food examples are that we in the organic sector are aiming for no GM. We're not aiming, and I have maybe a disagreement with some colleagues from the US on this, I'm not sure. We're not aiming for 1% GM, which is what the GM-free label in America actually has as a limit. Nor are we aiming for 0.9%, which some people in Europe claim the EU law is. Actually, EU law on organic is quite clear, no GM. Now, if you don't achieve that, you then get into the sorts of things which Joy was talking about, of investigating, looking where's the problem, and so on. But one of the most interesting developments to my mind in the GM soya animal feed discussion, and that's where the big quantity of GM is still coming in to Europe in non-organic animal feed, is that new production is starting in Europe, in the Danube region, of soya. And one of the reasons that companies in places like Germany and even in the UK are taking an interest in this is, of course, they're growing soya in an area where there's no GM at all and no danger of contamination as long as you get your supply chains through right. So this idea that Lorea might have to move to Turkey to grow her cotton isn't entirely far-fetched. Now, I said I'd come back to pesticides, and we're trusted on this, but it's worth bearing in mind, first of all, that we live in a pesticide-laden world. PCBs and DDT, which are largely banned now all over the world, are in all samples of human breast milk from all over the world. They're banned in 1972 in the US, PCBs in 1976. They are still in use, but they are ubiquitous in your blood, in any women here, I'm afraid, in your breast milk if you're breastfeeding. There's been a recent survey by Greenpeace in Europe which found glyphosate in breast milk as well. In 2003, the World Wildlife Fund checked samples from volunteers in the UK. They found the PCBs and DDT. One person's blood contained 49 different chemicals, included flame retardants and chemicals from household products, as well as chemicals from food and agriculture. And you may think that's an unbelievable number, but then people who are organic farmers and in the organic industry don't often recognize or keep up with just how ubiquitous chemicals are in non-organic farming. In the UK, 2 record wheat crops were grown in 2015. One was sprayed 14 times with 15 different chemicals. That's 15 different active ingredients, number of actual chemicals, because each spray has several chemicals with much more, and another one 18 times with 23 different chemicals. We also grow, and those are all the lists of chemicals, so I'm not making it up. Anyone wants to challenge me? We grow a crop called oilseed rape in England. It's canola in North America, mainly for oil, vegetable oil and industrial oils. And this is very ubiquitous now in the UK. And this is a normal field, an average sort of farmer, sprayed with 22 different chemicals. This is apart from fertilizers, just the chemicals going on as pesticides, insecticides, fungicides, growth regulators, and all of those sprays will be a compound of several different chemicals, some of which may be more toxic than the active ingredient. We know in Roundup, glyphosate, that some of the adjuvants, some of the chemicals that are used with Roundup, with glyphosate, are more toxic on their own than glyphosate is on its own. And they're not tested, by the way, because they're simply additives that don't count, apparently. Okay, I've finished this little digression into why we're so much better and why we should be so proud of organic, with just a quick summary of the 2 most ubiquitous chemicals in the world. This is the most widely used insecticide now, grown very quickly, class of chemicals called neonicotinoids. They're based on nicotine, as it sounds like, they're nerve agents, and they're used as seed dressings. The seeds are coated with them. A scientist in the UK has found that about 5% of the chemical stay on the crop, and they're in the crop its whole life. About 94% go straight into the soil and into water. And that's why Dutch scientists have found water, and American scientists have found fresh water so polluted and birds being killed and so on. They're the most widely sold insecticide in the world. The most widely sold weed killer is, of course, Roundup. And even in places where there are no GM crops, like the UK, use is climbing. In the UK, bizarrely, to my mind, it's used just before crops are harvested on wheat and barley and oats, as I mentioned earlier, to kill the crop so that the big combines can go through quicker. Just terrible. Now, we avoid all of that, and we should be proud of it, and that's why people trust us. And there are lots of other reasons why people trust us. We produced a report on this a while back, the Soil Association, and we've now got an infographic, something that's very popular with people, which is available on our website, showing the advantages organic compared to non-organic cotton, with the things, the integrity and the trust based in the on the left-hand side of the infographic, both on the farm and in the supply chain, the sorts of things that GOTS would cover. Now, I mentioned earlier on today in the working group I was in, how important good scientific information is to back up the sort of stuff you can put on an infographic. We had a government action plan in the UK which looked at differences between BCI and organic and found some significant differences. We are now having very good conversations with BCI in the UK, I should say, very constructive. Textile Exchange did a really wonderful bit of work on an LCA which showed really significant differences between organic and non-organic on a scientific basis. And I wanted just to pick up climate change in final ed, and I'm doing for time, hope I'm not overrunning too much. Because President Obama said yesterday that the Paris Agreement is going to be finalised and signed, become law, in November next month. And it's going to be a major driver of farming all over the world over the next 20, 30 years. The major driver, along with human health on the food side. But for organic cotton, incredibly important what we do on climate change. Because, thanks to the French government at COP22 in Paris, a target was inserted into the agreement about soil carbon, to increase soil carbon levels by 0.4% per year over all soils. It's a general target. You can quibble with the detail, but really importantly, agriculture's on the climate change agenda, which, as I say, Obama has said will be agreed very soon. And organic cotton growing, just like all organic farming, will reduce climate change impact significantly, as Textile Exchange's LCA showed. But we will also, all organic farmers in the room, will be taking carbon from the air and putting it in the soil and keeping it there. Because we not only have less nitrogen fertilizer, we can sequester that carbon. And a lot of people think that the biggest contribution that farming will make in future as we change from chemical and nitrogen-based manufactured fertilizer farming to organic will be to take carbon from the air and put it in the soil. And it's all the things you do in organic farming: green manures, returning crop residues, legumes, alfalfa or clover or whatever they might be. And they're all central to organic methods, and all of them take carbon from the air and put it in the soil. And the figures are really quite staggering. There's been a meta-analysis which found significantly more atmospheric carbon per hectare in organic than non-organic farms, about 450 kilograms. It means you can get a significant, nearly half a tonne of carbon in topsoil per hectare per year, depending on the soils and the farming system and so on. But we're talking about looking at all farming, huge changes. Okay, I ought to come to an end and just say a word or two about going back to integrity and trust. I have to say, as a farmer, I find being inspected very nerve-wracking, quite frightening. Once a year, everybody in the farm gets together, we have a certain amount of panic, we try to get all the paperwork together, we think what we've done and what we haven't done. It's rigorous and thorough. We have 2 or 3 different inspections. That's the one that really puts you through it, positively, constructively, and thoroughly and rigorously. And compared to other claims that farmers make, certainly in my country, organic is way ahead of the game, in terms of integrity and trust and reliability. All of us find the supply chains difficult. The FSC do in forestry, the MSC do in fish, there are other supply chains, and organic cotton's no different, and that's a challenge to us. And I think we have to admit, and I would admit, and we should all admit, we've got a lot of work to do there. And there aren't enough people certified to GOTS. We've got to do more in that area. And it's not surprising that Greenpeace picked on that bit of our supply chain to launch their Dirty Laundry campaign several years ago. But I believe that overwhelmingly in this room, in this movement, we are committed to integrity. As Joy said, we need to be. And that's my firm belief that we are. Thank you very much.